Hi y'all, it's Bailey, also known as Well-Read PhD here and on Instagram. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm super excited to bring you my recent reads, but make sure that you have subscribed if you haven't already, because on Thursday I will be dropping a special DNF episode of all the books that I have not finished this year and also my reasons for not finishing them. Some good, some bad, we'll get into it then. But for now, I want to get into the 4 books I've read in the last week. Most of them were bangers. I had 2 5-star reads, so let's get into it. The first book I read this week was The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. If you remember, I talked about this in my mid-year book freakout tag, which I will pin below. Basically, this teenage girl, Barbara Van Laar, goes missing in 1975 at a summer camp in upstate New York. Her family owns the camp, and so it is a really frantic search for her because not only is a camper missing, but it's also this wealthy camp owner's daughter who goes missing. And to make matters worse, they also had a child disappear from the summer camp and go missing in the same woods 14 years earlier. So that still was unsolved. They never found the brother bear, and now they're trying to find Barbara. So this sends shockwaves throughout the whole Adirondack community, through these small towns where there are all these working class people that help build the camp and help run the camp. And then there's the Van Laars and their wealthy guests. And then there's obviously the campers themselves. So you have all of these very different perspectives, including the police who are trying to work the crime and figure out, what's happened. There are all of these different interconnected threads, and you get multiple perspectives as well as multiple time jumps back to Bear's disappearance as well as Barbara's disappearance. If you're on Bookstagram or BookTube, you've likely heard of this book. I think Jimmy Fallon posted how it's in his book club the other day, but it is very much the book of the summer. It is sold out everywhere. I had a friend say that she's like 150 on the wait list. I think there are many reasons why this book is so hyped. And one is that Liz Moore is just a very gifted writer. She is very good at description, about setting, about noticing details, about sort of balancing plot with character development and really making you feel for each of the perspectives she's presenting. I think the setting is extremely summery. We've got a summer camp in the 70s in upstate New York. Everyone's out and about. There are rich people behaving badly. There are, working class people trying to get by. There are all of these weird, interesting red herrings and subplots and multiple layers of conflict, but it doesn't ever feel overwhelming because I think Liz Moore is very good at balancing what she's telling you versus what the mystery is. And so it's just very satisfying. I will say I kind of predicted the ending the second I saw like a clue dropped. You can follow along with it. It's not one of those red herring out of nowhere Deus Ex Machina sort of resolutions at the end where you're like, oh, I never saw that coming, or oh, was this totally random character? It's like, no, you can kind of piece together what's going on, but as you peel back layer and layer and layer of this family and the surrounding area's history, it is just so compelling and you can't put it down. It's very long and it's very slow burn and very literary. So if you like your thrillers a little more popcorny, I don't know if this will necessarily work for you, but I love a slow burn. I love the sort of building of tension and suspense. And so for me, I really, really loved this book. And so it definitely is worth the hype. If you've been wondering, I would 100% pick this up. If you already read this book and loved it and want something that's like it, or if you're 150th on the wait list like my friend is, then I have some comps that I think you might like. I would say Bright Young Women would be my first recommendation by Jessica Knoll. It is an account of the University of Florida sorority killings, but told through the perspective of the sorority president. And it talks a lot about the sorority women and how they're impacted by their friends' murders and how, they were basically left to fend for themselves and like what the fallout from one of these tragic events is. And so I thought that was really compelling. It also is very literary, very descriptive, does a good balance of mixing introspection with the plot. And it really just feels like this slice of historic Americana, but in a thriller. If you like a literary thriller, but you aren't super sold on the whole historic Americana thing, I would recommend Dirt Creek by Haley Scrivener. I think this is one of my favorite books that I read last year. It just feels very August, very September, very like hot summer. It's set in the Australian bush. A child disappears and it's this small town, this small community again, and figuring out the fallout from that, figuring out what happened. But it plays with form a little more, and I think that it has a really unique setting and really unique perspective. If you love the summer camp vibe, but you want to sort of turn the notch up a little bit, I would say The Honeys by Ryan LaSala is probably what you're looking for. It is set at a summer camp. You've got a gender fluid main character who is returning to this summer camp after his sister's death. And Mars uses he and they pronouns and is trying to sort of figure out, where he fits in these really prescribed Americana views of femininity and masculinity, finds himself sort of enthralled by this group called the Honeys at the summer camp that his sister went to, and is trying to grieve his sister and figure out why she was so close with these people and if they can sort of give insights into her mysterious death. So that gets very spooky. I think that's a little kookier and more out there, a little more Bunny by Mona Awad than the other two are, but I think it's a pretty good comp. The next book I read was The Gulf by Rachel Cochran. This was a debut novel that I was really excited to find. I literally just found it on Storygraph when you click browse similar reads to God of the Woods, but essentially it is also a literary thriller that was set in the 1970s, but this is set in a small town in the Gulf Coast of Texas. Basically, the main character, who is a closeted queer woman, is trying to figure out what's happened to her friend's mother. She was very close with her friend's mother because her own mother abandoned her when she was just a baby, and so she essentially has been raised in this really small, tight-knit religious community. So when her friend's mother dies, she is told it's an accident, but is really suspicious of it and sort of investigates a little further. As she's investigating into this woman's death, she starts having flashbacks. She remembers things one way, and then she sort of, in discovering more about this woman, learns that things were not always as it seemed growing up. I would rank this probably about a 3-star read. It is definitely more literary than thriller. And I will say Rachel Cochran's prose is delicious. It is lush, it is descriptive. You feel the humidity of being in this sort of dying, hurricane-destroyed town. There's really not a lot of young people. There's not a lot of industry. People are trying to figure out what's happening. And you really feel the sort of tension of patriarchy settling in this town as well, where women are not really listened to and discounted, and so when one of them dies, people really don't look into it. The plotting was a bit confusing. I found the pace to be off. I think it was very slow burn in the front half, and then I would say the last 20%, things started happening really fast and in a way that didn't really work for me all the time. I did like some of the twists at the end, but I think my biggest hangup was honestly with the main character, Louisa. She is grappling with a lot, and I understand that, but she really was difficult to root for. She kept making decisions that were the opposite of what I would expect her to do. She kept making what I thought were bad decisions. I did not care for either of her love interests, and I definitely did not care for the way that she spoke about her family in a lot of ways. As a debut, I would still read something by this author, and I thought overall it was a good story. I think there just needed to be a little more fine-tuning. There was a lot of weird buildup around Jehovah's Witnesses, which was very strange for me. I didn't really understand the point entirely of these people's involvement in this denomination. I think if you want a little more thriller, I would recommend Stacey Willingham's books. So she did A Flicker in the Dark and then All the Dangerous Things. These are very Southern Gothic atmosphere. One is set in the bayou of Baton Rouge, and one I think is in Charleston or Savannah. Sort of atmospheric, sort of Spanish moss on the trees vibes. I also think that Megan Miranda's All the Missing Girls could work for you. That's set in North Carolina and it's kind of spooky, and it's supposed to be more thriller, but really it is more sort of uncovering layers of truth of the past with a really unique narration style. So that might work for you. I think if the religion part is what makes things kind of spooky or tense for you, which I think is what the author was intending, I think God Spare the Girls by Kelsey McKinney will land a little bit better for you, and it's a little lighter. So it's still heavy. It's still this sort of oppressive heat and scandal around religion and a pastor, but in a way that to me resolved at a better pace and built the tension and plot at a better pace than The Gulf did. It's also still set in Texas. So if you're a Texan like me and you love reading Texas books, I think that could be a good fit for you. My next read was my second 5-star read. It is Embassy Wife by Katie Crouch, and I loved every second of this novel. Follows 3 women of the Windhoek International School in Windhoek, Namibia. Persephone, who is a foreign service officer, diplomat's wife, and has followed him around the globe with her kids and loves being an embassy wife. She finds it her duty to sort of represent America in whatever country she is in, and really tries to be a good example, especially because this is set in the Trump administration. So she's like, listen, we're not like him. So Persephone takes that very seriously. Amanda has just moved to Windhoek because her husband got a Fulbright to Namibia to finish a history book that he is ostensibly writing. Amanda is not happy with this decision. Amanda's actually very pissed that she's in Namibia because she was a C-suite exec in Silicon Valley, and her daughter is mad at her for uprooting the family to follow the husband to Namibia. So Amanda has just gotten there. She's trying to adjust. Then there is Mila, who is an Obambo woman who is from Namibia and whose husband is a Namibian official. So her daughter also goes to this international school. Mila is definitely in the know that her husband is doing some possibly shady things, but doesn't want to know anymore because she is living a life of luxury. But her husband tells her it would be good for her to befriend the Americans for his business. So she says, okay, I don't know what your business is, but yeah, I'll befriend the Americans. All of these people have secrets. All of these people are interconnected in different ways. And all of these people are going to be involved in school drama that then turns into a full international scandal. I cannot express to you how much I love this book. It might be one of my favorite books of 2024. It's like if you took Big Little Lies and put it in a Namibia international school and ratcheted it up like 20 degrees. Basically, it absolutely nailed what it feels like to be a sort of American abroad. I was a Fulbrighter, so I am very familiar with this sort of foreign service and like you are representing Americaness of embassy life. And it also nailed the sort of, okay, well, what does it mean to represent America when one, you don't always want to, and two, you don't agree with what America is doing most of the time, and three, know that you're part of a neo-imperial project. So this really grappled with all of that in a way that wasn't just rah rah go America. In fact, it was largely condemnatory of Americans abroad and gave a lot of perspective to Obambo and Nama characters in the book who were kind of like, we don't understand what these American people are doing. They come here, they think they're like running shit, but they are just very confused and they don't really know what's going on, but they will give us their money. And so it was really, really fun to read all of the drama and mess and scandal that was happening amidst that cultural critique. There was incredible character work, incredible dialogue, great description, unique premise, unique setting. All in all, I thought it was fabulous. There's real drama and there's real high stakes and there's also some petty shit. So in general, I cannot recommend this enough. There are some like threads that don't always get resolved, but I didn't mind it. I thought this was a hilarious time. I think most of my comps are not quite as light as Embassy Wife, but I think that they are similar in either the mess or the settler colonialism and Americans abroad situation. So I think if you were looking for expat drama, I think The Sunsets in Singapore by Kende Felipe is a really good comp. It follows 3 women of the Nigerian diaspora. There's an American, there's a British person, there's someone who's actually from Nigeria, but they are all living in Singapore and how their friendship sort of evolves as they are all interacting in these different ways in this friend group, in this expat community in Singapore. That gets into some real drama and some real high stakes drama as well. And I would say The Fortunes of Jaded Women by Carolyn Huynh is another really good one. It explores 3 generations of a Vietnamese family and all the women of the family. It follows, I think, 9 character arcs of these women of one family who are supposedly cursed and the ways that their lives intersect even as they're all across the globe. There's one in Bangkok, there's one in Singapore, there's one in the family house in LA, Orange County, there's one up in Silicon Valley. There are a couple working at their family's restaurants and their family's nail salons. And so it gives a really good sort of intercultural and also interpersonal drama to the mix that I think is lighthearted and has like a gag factor, but also has a lot of poignant observations on being Vietnamese and being a woman. And I think that's a good comp as well. For some heavier reads about white people in Africa behaving badly, I mean, see all of the last, 300, 400, 500 years of history. But I would say specifically, obviously, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart is a classic to understand the sort of legacy of colonial structures by white people in Africa. I think The Promise by Damon Galgut is another recommendation I would have for sort of understanding the shift of before and after apartheid in South Africa and how that evolves over several decades in one family, but doesn't really evolve, and how apartheid still has a hold in South Africa, because I think that's also pretty important in the Namibian context, because Namibia was part of South Africa. I think The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver is always going to be my number one recommendation for a similar sort of settler colonial story, but it is about missionaries to the Congo in the 60s and how that sort of plays out amidst government upheaval and revolution. Finally, I think We Need New Names by No Violet Bulawayo is another good one. It is set in Zimbabwe and it is less sort of drama and more coming. It gives perspective, one, to a Zimbabwean author who lived colonialism and who lived the sort of shift from white people colonizing her country to an independent Zimbabwe, in the same way that Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, all of the countries in the southern tip of Africa really have experienced. But also it gives you some fun little observations. I think there's some fun observations because it's these village kids who are living in Zimbabwe and trying to figure out like what life is and, you know, where they can get Coca-Cola and all that kind of stuff. So it is heavy, very much so, but also I think less heavy than Things Fall Apart or The Promise or The Poisonwood Bible. The fourth book I read this week was Intimacies by Kitamura, and I think this was recommended as a similar read to Embassy Wife. I do not think so. I think it is about an American who is living abroad, but in a very different context and a very different tone to it. So an interpreter has moved from New York to The Hague to work the international court. She is finally looking for a place to call home. She has a lot of different cultures and upbringings, and she speaks French and she speaks Japanese and she speaks English and she's learning Dutch. And so she is an interpreter and a translator for these people who have committed some war crimes. And so she has moved to The Hague, and she almost immediately is thrown into a tumultuous romantic situation. She's trying to make friends, and of course she is dealing with having to interpret the war criminals' words and what that psychologically does for her, and understanding how she can impact how facts are perceived or received by people. So this is very literary. It is very contemplative and reflective, and I would say like slice of life. It is very much about this specific part of this character's life. There aren't really lessons learned. There aren't really a whole lot of things that happen in the book. It's just like this woman is in some really interesting situations, and how will she handle them? And also, how will she interpret the environment around her? Basically, she is trying to figure out. There's a lot of really beautiful reflection on perceptions of truth and gray areas of truth and how to interpret what one perceives. So there's a lot of, dinner scenes where someone is saying something and she is sort of picking up these undercurrents of something else, or someone does something and she interprets it to be one way and is like, oh, but I don't know if they intended it that way. So there's a lot of overthinking, and there's a lot of reflecting on reflecting. So I really enjoyed that. Not a lot happens though. So if you are not into that, I would not pick up this book. It is only about 260-ish pages, so it's a short one, and I read it in a day, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was different than what I was expecting. I think I was expecting a little more suspense, but I do think that Kitamura is really good at building the sort of internal tension between what is like the subtext of all these people's interactions. If you like books about translation like this, I would say The Center by Aisha Manazir Siddiqui would be the other one I would say that's a little more tongue-in-cheek than Intimacies. I think it's still literary. I think it's just a little more lighthearted, while also still being pretty sinister. And that's about a woman who is trying to learn a language using this really crazy immersion program that, essentially turns out to be very spooky. If you're looking for more moral gray area, wandering and pondering slice of life and over analyzing kind of books, I would say Big Swiss by Jen Bacon is the blueprint. This is very much like a specific moment in Greta's life, and a little more humorous in the same way that The Center is a little more humorous. Another recommendation would be Joan is Okay by Weike Wong. It is about a doctor during COVID who is trying to figure out everything in this very specific moment in time. She is a doctor who's working in a hospital while she's being told that there's going to be a lockdown, and she is an essential worker. And so she's navigating all of that while also navigating living on her own and being a single Chinese woman and also a doctor. And so she's sort of interpreting things through a very specific lens of clinicality and detachedness that I think is similar to how the Intimacies narrator interprets things through her own linguistic lens. I would say August Blue by Deborah Levy is another good comp for this. It's another one of those wandering, pondering, very specific slice of life. You are following a pianist as she has walked off stage during one of her concerts and sort of said she's retiring and quitting the piano business entirely. Following her through this very specific crisis in her life, and as she's thinking through these larger questions and memories, while also just sort of seeing what's happening in the moment and taking signs from that. And also very sort of just vibes and just going with the flow as you follow this character through a very sort of niche event in their life. So yeah, that's what I've got for you. Stay tuned and subscribe, like, comment below. Obviously, if you've read any of these, I would love to hear from you here or on Instagram, but stay tuned because again, on Thursday, I will be dropping my DNFs. So happy reading, everyone, and see you then.